Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take some really interesting source material, often something shared by you, the listener, and, well, we really get into it.
Yeah, our job is basically to unpack the main ideas, maybe find some surprising links, and just help you see what's going on under the surface.
Think of us as guides, sort of helping navigate the info, pulling out those key bits that might make you think differently.
Exactly. Or just see something familiar in a totally new light.
And for this deep dive, we've got a source that, wow, it definitely does that. It's an article by Dr. Mahmudjon Kuchkarov called Newton's Stolen Science, an Eastern Origin Story.
Mm-hmm. And this piece, it takes aim right at, one of the biggest stories in Western science history.
Yeah.
The Isaac Newton narrative.
Right. The story we all know, solitary genius, apple falls, Principia Opticks, boom, science revolution. It's a huge story.
A very powerful one. But this source, the one we're looking at today, it examines that story, finds things it calls major anomalies, and asks some really tough questions.
Yeah, it suggests a completely different possibility for where some of that science actually originated.
Okay, so let's start with the core puzzle the source brings up right away. It looks at Newton's two big ones, Principia Mathematica from 1687 and Opticks, which came later, 1704.
And the basic question the source asks is, why is Principia in Latin, the academic language then, but Opticks is in English?
Right. The article mentions the usual explanation is, he wanted a wider audience later on, but the source says that feels... well, it uses the words insufficient and evasive.
Interesting. And it's not just the language, is it? The source points to the actual manuscripts, too.
Yeah, exactly. The source claims that the original papers attributed to Newton show inconsistent handwriting styles.
Okay.
And not just like how your signature changes over years. The article specifically says entirely different hands, like multiple people writing.
Wow. So different languages for the main works and now multiple handwritings in the source documents.
Uh-huh. And the article hammers this point in pretty much any other scholarly context. If you saw that kind of thing, language switches, different handwriting, it would immediately raise red flags.
Red flags about what? Like who actually wrote it?
Yeah, questions about authorship, forgery, or deliberate posthumous reconstruction. Serious stuff.
So this leads to the source's big opening question, right? Are we looking at one single brilliant mind here, or... what was the phrase?
Or, as the source puts it quite provocatively, are we looking at a well-designed, Eurocentric branding operation? That's the central puzzle it wants us to think about.
Okay, a branding operation. So if the source is questioning the lone genius idea, how does it suggest this? Alternative might have actually happened. What's the proposed mechanism?
Well, the article points to a really specific moment in history. The fall of Granada in 1492.
The end of Muslim rule in Spain.
Exactly. And the source argues this event wasn't just political, it kicked off a massive transfer of knowledge from the East to Europe.
And this wasn't just ideas floating around, it was physical stuff. Texts.
That's the claim. The source talks about the seizure of thousands of manuscripts, actual documents from libraries, institutions, written in Arabic, Persian, Turkic.
Okay, and what kind of knowledge are we talking about?
Advanced stuff, according to the source. Fields like astronomy, mathematics, mechanics, and optics. And then the article makes this connection. It points out that European universities started popping up en masse not long after this influx.
And it asks if that's just a coincidence.
Right. Is it coincidence or cause and effect?
The source actually names names too, doesn't it? Eastern scholars whose work might have been those manuscripts.
It does. It lists major figures like al-Biruni, al-Farabi, al-Khwarizmi, al-Farghani, Ulugh Beg, polymaths.
And the article claims these thinkers had already worked out complex theories about motion, gravity, optics, how the planets move.
Yes, centuries before Newton. That's the key phrase the source uses.
So the argument isn't necessarily that Newton invented nothing, but maybe that works like Principia weren't discovering things from zero.
Exactly. The source suggests they might reframe them in a different language under a different name and with a new cultural signature. It's more about repackaging existing, highly advanced knowledge acquired from the East.
Okay, that's a big claim. Does the source offer more specifics? Maybe about the science itself?
It does. It gets into how these fields were viewed differently. It looks at traditional Turkic and Islamic natural philosophy.
And what did it find there?
The claim is that in that tradition, optics and mechanics weren't really separate subjects. They were seen as fundamentally linked, not separate disciplines.
Linked by what principles?
Well, the article says they both relied on things like geometric reasoning, ideas about symmetry principles, and shared mathematical laws of motion and reflection.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, the source uses one, the angle that light bounces off a mirror and the angle the particle bounces off a wall. In that Eastern tradition, those were seen as basically manifestations of the same natural principle, a unified view.
Okay, interesting. So that's the Eastern approach, according to the source. How does that compare to how things developed in Europe?
The source argues that in the European system that emerged, that unity got broken. Knowledge got split up, fragmented into separate boxes. Mechanics, molecular physics, electromagnetism, optics, atomic theory.
All the subjects we learn in school today?
Pretty much. And the source then asks this really pointed question about that split. Was breaking it all up genuine scientific progress, or was it maybe potentially a form of obfuscation of source material?
Meaning a way to hide where the unified ideas originally came from, by chopping them up.
That's the implication the source raises, that the fragmentation might have served to obscure the origins and the interconnectedness found in the earlier Eastern work.
Okay, let's shift to maybe the most famous science anecdote ever. Newton and the apple. Does the source address that?
It does. It mentions that, the story itself is often kind of mocked, but it says the deeper issue isn't the falling apple, it's what Newton supposedly figured out about gravity because of it.
And what does the source say about those ideas of gravity?
Well, it makes a really strong claim about Al-Biruni, who was writing way back in the 11th century.
Okay.
The source asserts that Al-Biruni had already explored, in detail, concepts like mass-based attraction, understanding the curvature of the Earth, and describing the relative motion of celestial bodies. Core gravitational ideas.
So the source is basically saying the fundamental concepts of gravity weren't new with Newton. They'd been developed centuries earlier in the East.
That's precisely the argument. And it suggests Al-Biruni's works, likely among those manuscripts transferred after 1492, just weren't compatible with the emerging European narrative.
So what happened to them, according to the source?
The article claims these complex Eastern ideas had to be, quote, translated, then stripped of authorship, and finally rebranded as Western discoveries, a deliberate process of appropriation and relabeling.
Wow. Okay, so putting all these pieces together, the language issues, the handwriting, the influx of Eastern texts, these earlier theories, the source comes to a really bold conclusion.
Or hypothesis. Yeah, this is probably the most provocative point in the article. It asks directly, could Newton be not one person, but an editorial construct?
An editorial construct, like not a real individual scientist in the way we think. What will be the point of that, according to the source?
The article suggests several possible goals for such a construct, things like legitimizing Western scientific supremacy, actively whitewashing the Eastern roots of physics, and consolidating authorship under a Euro-Christian banner.
Especially during that period of European expansion and identity building.
Exactly, and it ties us back to the language thing we started with.
How so?
Under this construct idea, using Latin for Principia acts like a seal of intellectual authenticity. It makes it look like it belongs to the established European scholarly world.
Okay.
Then Release in Optics later in English helps to democratize and mass distribute the repackaged knowledge to a wider English-speaking audience, cementing it as Western science.
And the source says this construct idea would explain those anomalies.
It claims it fits the evidence. It would explain the linguistic inconsistency. It would explain the handwriting discrepancy if multiple people were translating or compiling.
And crucially,
the source says, it would explain why no one dares ask where Newton learned these things, because the answer would lead outside Europe. It suggests the whole narrative was built to prevent that question from even being asked.
This sounds like a huge undertaking. Does the source see this as just happening with Newton? Or is something bigger?
Oh, it definitely presents it as part of a larger, repeating historical pattern. It even lays out a kind of 4-step model.
Okay, what are the steps?
Step 1, according to the source, seize advanced Eastern knowledge, the manuscripts.
Step 2.
Translate the content. But the source suggests this is often more about assimilation, about repackaging, not really about deep cross-cultural understanding.
Okay. Step 3.
Suppress the original source. Erase the names, the original language, the cultural context, make it disappear.
And the final step. Step 4.
Rebrand it. Put new Western names on it. Give credit to European figures.
And the source explicitly names names here.
It does. It lists Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton as examples of this final rebranding step. Major figures.
And it claims this wasn't just physics, but happened elsewhere too.
Yeah, the article states this pattern mirrors what happened to philosophy, medicine, and even linguistics. It paints it as a widespread, systemic process of knowledge transfer and, well, reattribution.
So if we take this perspective seriously, the one laid out in the article, what's the impact? What does the source say is the real cost here?
Well, it talks about the cost from two angles. For people whose heritage connects to the Islamic world, Central Asia, the Turkic regions, the source says the tragedy is not just stolen authorship, it is the systematic erasure of your intellectual ancestors from the pages of history. It's losing that connection to your own heritage.
That's powerful. And what about the cost for people in the West?
The source argues there's a loss there, too. It's believing in a myth of spontaneous genius, disconnected from the global exchange of knowledge. It's missing the bigger picture of how ideas travel and build on each other across cultures.
And the source kind of puts it back on the listener, on you, right? Asking how hearing this perspective changes how you think about the science history you learned.
Yeah, what does it make you question about the standard stories we've all heard? It definitely pushes you to reconsider the origins.
Right. So just to recap, we've dug into Dr. Mahmudjon Kuchkarov's article, Newton's Stolen Science. We looked at the anomalies he flags language, handwriting that spark his inquiry.
We explored the mechanism he proposes for how Eastern science might have been appropriated, linking it back to 1492 and that huge transfer of manuscripts.
We talked about the really bold idea, Newton as a possible editorial construct, aimed at legitimizing Western science and hiding Eastern roots.
And we touched on that broader pattern the source describes: seize, translate, suppress, rebrand, which it claims happened across multiple fields.
And just to be clear, our aim here was to really understand and unpack the specific arguments and the viewpoint presented in this particular source. We're presenting its claims.
Absolutely. And the article really leaves you with a final thought to chew on. Using the source's own words again, we don't study Newton. We study the Turkic scientific tradition, rewritten in Latin and English under someone else's name.
Wow. Okay. So what does that final thought make you consider about the history you thought you knew?